There was a specific moment every evening in the 1960s when an entire street full of children turned toward home at almost exactly the same instant, without a single word passed between them. Nobody blew a whistle, nobody made a phone call, the sky just changed colour somewhere behind the rooftops and the TV antennas, and then the streetlights flickered on, and somehow that was enough. A whole neighbourhood of kids simply understood. Almost nobody remembers deciding to obey that signal. It wasn't a rule written down anywhere, the way a curfew might be posted on a refrigerator door held up with a magnet shaped like a state you'd never visited. It was closer to an agreement the entire block had made without ever discussing it, honoured night after night all summer long, for reasons nobody could have explained if you'd stopped them mid-sprint to ask. That signal doesn't organise anyone's afternoon anymore, not because streetlights stopped coming on, because somewhere along the way an entire generation of kids stopped needing to watch the sky for permission to keep playing a little longer. Everything that happened before those lights came on, the forts, the bike rides, the games that started themselves in the middle of the street, depended on a kind of freedom that quietly isn't extended to children the same way anymore. One of these 10 traditions didn't fade slowly the way you might expect either. It ended abruptly, in barely a single generation, because of one invention that changed how a parent could reach their own child. Once that happened, nothing about the rest of the afternoon ever worked quite the same way again. We'll get to that invention. We're a long way from it yet, though, because before any of this disappeared, it belonged to a stretch of time that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. The hours between the last school bell and dinner, hours that belonged to absolutely nobody but the kids living inside them. None of them ever thought of that freedom as unusual at the time. Why would they? A 10-year-old doesn't sit around marvelling at trust. He just rides his bike until something interesting happens, and goes home when the sky tells him to. It's only looking back now, decades later, that the whole arrangement starts to feel almost impossible. An entire culture quietly agreeing to let its children disappear into a neighbourhood for hours at a time, confident they'd find their own way back. That confidence wasn't naive. It was earned block by block, the way a neighbourhood earns familiarity. Every yard known by heart, every shortcut memorised, every dog on the street identified by bark alone, long before anyone bothered learning its owner's name. No map of that territory was ever drawn. It didn't need to be. Every kid on the street was quietly redrawing it in his own head, every single day, just by living inside it. And here's the part that's easy to miss. Almost none of what disappeared from those afternoons vanished for 10 separate reasons. Nearly all of it traces back to the same slow shift, one that touched every single tradition on this list at once, even though it won't fully reveal itself until we've walked through nearly everything else first. Some of it went quietly, worn down by convenience over the decades. At least one piece of it ended so suddenly that people who lived through it still describe the change like something snapping, so we'll start where all of this began. Not with the biggest loss, with the smallest, most private one. On the edge of nearly every neighbourhood being built through the 1960s sat a patch of land that didn't belong to anyone yet. The gap between one finished street and the next, still raw, still unclaimed, waiting for a house that hadn't been built. To an adult, it was undeveloped property. To a group of kids, it was the only real estate in the world they'd ever get to govern themselves. They built forts there out of scrap wood and old blankets, nailed together with more enthusiasm than skill, structures that wouldn't survive a strong wind but somehow felt permanent while they stood. A hand-lettered sign usually went up somewhere on the frame, members only in a kid's careful, uneven handwriting, announcing, to absolutely nobody in particular, that this small patch of dirt had rules now, and none of them had been written by an adult. It was the closest thing to owning property a child would ever experience. Not a bedroom, which still technically belonged to the house, a structure built by hand, on land nobody had claimed yet, governed entirely by logic that made sense to nobody over the age of 12. As the suburbs kept filling in through the following decades, those in-between lots quietly stopped existing. Houses got built where forts used to stand. Driveways got paved where a plywood door used to hang from 2 rusted hinges. Nobody mourned it out loud at the time. It just became one more finished street, indistinguishable from all the others on the block. The lot got a house built on it eventually, but for one summer, it was the only property in the world that belonged entirely to a group of 10-year-olds. Losing a patch of unclaimed land was one kind of ending, quiet, gradual, barely noticed while it happened. The next tradition disappeared because of something kids carried in their own pockets, and it says something about how differently an entire generation used to measure what counted as valuable. Kids moved through those same neighbourhoods carrying small economies entirely their own. Comic books, marbles, baseball cards traded door to door on porches up and down the block, with no adult ever involved in a single transaction. A stack of comics changed hands for a bag of marbles. A rare card got argued over for 20 minutes on somebody's front step before a deal finally got struck, on terms only the two kids involved would ever fully understand. It was commerce without money, a child's first real experience negotiating, valuing something, occasionally regretting a trade the moment it was too late to take back. Nobody graded those comics. Nobody consulted a price guide. The two kids trading them simply decided, between themselves, what felt fair, and that decision was the entire economy. As collecting shifted towards something more organised through the following decades, official price guides, protective sleeves, a genuine market value attached to items that used to be worth exactly what a 10-year-old said they were worth. The casual, door-to-door trading culture that had defined the 60s quietly stopped happening at all. Nobody graded those comics. They just decided between themselves what felt fair, and that was the whole economy. That economy ran on foot traffic, porch to porch, door to door. The next tradition ran on something even simpler, a bicycle, and absolutely nowhere in particular to be, which might be the purest form of freedom on this entire list. A bicycle in the 1960s wasn't transportation to somewhere specific, it was the entire plan for the afternoon in itself. Get on, start riding, and figure out where you ended up once something interesting got in the way. With residential streets carrying a fraction of the traffic they carry now, and neighbourhoods generally considered safe for a kid to wander unsupervised, riding for hours with no fixed destination wasn't unusual. It was simply Tuesday. The absence of a destination was the entire point. Nobody was waiting at the other end to see if you arrived anywhere, because you weren't going anywhere in particular. You rode until you found a friend already riding somewhere else, and then you rode with him instead, and neither of you had planned any of it more than 30 seconds in advance. As supervision norms shifted through the following decades, that specific kind of undirected wandering stopped being something parents simply allowed. It became something they actively discouraged, replaced by scheduled outings, planned routes, rides that go somewhere specific and come home on a timetable. The destination was never the point. Not knowing where you'd end up was the entire afternoon. That kind of aimless freedom eventually led somewhere specific anyway, though. Usually to a small counter with a bell above the door, and a version of a stop that most kids never thought to appreciate until decades after it disappeared. Almost every bike ride or walk home eventually passed a small store, a 5 and dime, a corner grocery, a drugstore counter with a soda fountain humming quietly in the back, where a nickel or a dime bought a deliberate pause in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable afternoon. These stores were small enough in nearly every neighbourhood that the owner usually knew which kids came in daily and what they were about to ask for before a single word left their mouth. It turned an ordinary walk home into a small event, a reason to stop. A coin counted out slowly, not because the amount mattered, but because the decision felt entirely your own to make. As small neighbourhood stores gradually gave way to larger chains reached by car rather than on foot, that specific, walkable, kid-scale version of the stop quietly stopped being part of most children's daily route at all. The store is probably still a store somewhere, it just isn't anyone's daily stop anymore. That stop was a small ritual for one kid at a time, walking alone or with a friend, coins jangling in a pocket. The next tradition belonged to an entire street at once, and it happened on the same patch of asphalt almost every single afternoon without fail. Stickball, kickball, and makeshift baseball games formed themselves spontaneously in the middle of the street, using storm drain covers as bases and a passing car as the only interruption anyone ever planned for. With residential traffic still light enough through the decade, the street itself functioned as the neighbourhood's default field. No permit required, no coach standing on the sideline, no schedule dictating when the game could start. Whoever showed up got picked into teams on the spot. Somebody always yelled, "Car!" The second one turned the corner, and the entire game paused just long enough to let it pass before picking back up exactly where it left off, as if the interruption had never happened at all. As traffic increased and organised youth leagues expanded through the following decades, the street itself stopped being available or considered appropriate as a place for children to play. The game didn't disappear. It just moved behind a fence onto a scheduled field, under an adult's whistle instead of nobody's. Somebody always yelled, "Car!" and the game paused for exactly as long as it needed to. Then it just kept going, the same way it always had. That game ended the moment the sky started changing colour. But before that happened, there was one small sound that could still find a kid 3 streets away, and almost everyone who grew up during this stretch of years remembers exactly what that sound was. Long before anyone had a way to reach a wandering child directly, many families developed a specific whistle, or call, or bell, distinct enough that a kid could hear it from blocks away, through the noise of an entire neighbourhood of children playing at once, and know instantly it meant them and absolutely nobody else. It carried across yards, over fences, past the sound of a dozen other kids shouting at their own games, somehow always cutting through clearly enough to reach exactly the one child it was meant for. It should have felt restrictive. Somehow it felt like the opposite, proof that somebody was keeping track of you, even while you were completely, happily out of sight. Once direct communication became possible, that specific skill, listening for one particular sound among dozens of others, trained by years of practice without anyone realizing they were being trained at all, quietly stopped being necessary. A phone in a pocket could reach one specific person instantly, removing the need for a signal that used to travel by sound across an entire block just to find you. Nobody could see you from 3 streets away. The whistle found you anyway. That whistle worked because you were always close enough to hear it, somewhere within its reach. The next tradition depended on something even simpler, a key and the specific trust it represented, which is easy to miss unless you were the exact kid holding it. At a certain age, without much ceremony, a kid was simply handed their own house key, often threaded onto a string and worn around the neck, resting cool against the chest the entire walk home from school. With both parents increasingly likely to be working through the decade, many children became genuinely responsible for themselves during the hour or two between the last bell and a parent's return. It felt like an initiation, proof that you'd quietly been upgraded from a child who needed watching to a person who could apparently be trusted alone in an entire empty house with nobody checking in. As supervision expectations shifted through the following decades, that unsupervised stretch of time became something parents actively tried to avoid rather than simply accept as ordinary, replaced gradually by after-school programs, childcare arrangements, structured solutions to a gap in the day that used to belong entirely to the child standing in it. It wasn't a heavy key, it just felt like it, resting against your chest the whole walk home. That trust extended to one child at a time, one key at a time. But something even bigger governed an entire street of them at once, and it never needed a single written rule, because every kid on the block understood it instantly, without ever once being told directly. On any given afternoon, without a phone call or a plan made in advance, kids from an entire street would somehow end up in the same yard at almost exactly the same time, drawn there by nothing more specific than a kind of shared instinct about where the day's activity was already gathering. Nobody organised it. It happened the way weather happens, kids drifting toward whichever porch or driveway already had the most going on, without a single one of them fully understanding why they knew to head there. As families grew more scheduled through the following decades, more likely to arrange a specific playdate than simply allow a child to wander toward wherever the day was already happening, that organic convergence quietly stopped occurring on its own. It got replaced by planned visits, arranged in advance, reliable in their own way, but missing the particular magic of a gathering nobody had to plan at all. Nobody sent word. Somehow, everybody still knew exactly where to be. That gathering had its own quiet gravity, pulling an entire street together without effort. But everything on this list so far, every yard, every game, every ride with no destination, eventually answered to one single signal, the same one this whole video has been building toward from the very first sentence. Just before the streetlights actually came on, the sky moved through a specific, narrow shade of colour. Not quite dusk yet, not quite evening. Something in between that every kid on the block somehow learned to recognise as an early warning, without a single person ever teaching them to watch for it. It gave the last hour of freedom its own particular tension. One more game, one more lap around the block, squeezed in before that colour finished changing completely, With no other way to be reached, children became fluent readers of the sky itself, treating its shifting shade as a countdown that started long before any actual light flickered on. Now that a phone can summon a child home at any exact moment, nobody needs to read a changing sky as a warning anymore. The warning simply arrives instead as a buzz in a pocket, precise and immediate, replacing a skill that used to be learned by paying attention to nothing but the colour hanging over your own street. The sky still turns that exact colour every single evening. Almost nobody's still outside anymore to notice it happening. That colour was only ever a warning, though. The beginning of the countdown, not the countdown's end. What came right after it is the exact moment this entire video has quietly been leading to since its very first sentence. When the streetlights finally flickered to life, there was no debate, no negotiation, no need for a single parent to call out a single name. Every kid on the block simply turned toward home at nearly the same instant, as if the whole street had rehearsed this exact moment 1,000 times before, even though nobody ever had. It wasn't really a rule, not in the way a rule usually works. It was closer to an agreement the entire neighbourhood had somehow reached without ever once discussing it out loud. The same amount of freedom extended to every child on the block, governed by exactly the same signal, every single evening, all summer long. As direct communication made it possible to reach a child at any given moment, that shared, universal, sky-based signal that had governed an entire generation's afternoons quietly stopped being necessary. It got replaced by something faster and more precise, and far more private. A phone call, a text, a location shared automatically between two devices, instead of announced by an entire sky-changing colour for an entire street to see at once. Of everything on this list, this is the moment that never really belonged to any single kid. It belonged to the whole street, all at once, every single evening, which is exactly why losing it feels less like losing an object, and more like losing a specific kind of belonging that nothing since has ever quite managed to replace. The lights still come on every night, exactly on time. They're just not calling anyone home anymore. None of these 10 traditions were really about forts, or bikes, or a nickel spent at a counter. Not one of them. They were about a specific communal trust that used to be extended to an entire street of children all at once, governed by nothing more complicated than the colour of the sky and a whistle that somehow always found you. A whole way of being trusted quietly wrapped itself around 10 ordinary afternoons, and when the reason for that trust changed, one phone, one text, one location shared automatically, so did the version of childhood that used to depend on it. People rarely miss the fort or the bike ride or the game itself. They miss being the exact kid the whole street somehow knew to look for at dusk. The streetlights still come on tonight, exactly the way they always have. The same flicker, the same colour, the same hour. Somewhere, decades ago, a whole street's worth of kids used to hear that as their own name being called, all at once, every single evening. That's the only part of this entire list that never found a replacement.